Now, I'd like you all to please raise your hands if you think that empires still exist. Okay. And now please raise your hands if you think that the US is an empire. All right, well, for those who maybe aren't so sure, just take a look at what's behind me. All right? These are the flags of the countries and territories in which the US, since its inception, has intervened militarily, politically, and economically, sometimes through a mixture of all three. Now, I'm just gonna appreciate this with y'all for a second. As you can see, some of these are repeated several times, right? Interesting. Folks, my name is Alejandra Torres Garcia, and as you could have imagined by now, I do believe that empires still exist. In fact, I believe that the US is an empire in denial. Employing a mixture of different disciplines within the social sciences, my concentration traces the genealogy of modern empire and the way that it informs global migration to the extent that it recolonizes immigrants in host nations. However, through the application of postcolonial theory, perhaps immigrants are able to decolonize their subjectivities. So before we get started, let me just quickly give you the definitions and summarize a modern empire and postcolonial theory. So, modern empire is characterized by the spatial and discursive classification and stratification of the world that codified foreign populations as subhuman and commodified indigenous peoples and African slaves. Today, empire has simply reorganized itself into a new paradigm that is contrary to the classic model, insofar as it is now powerful nation states, right, with fluid borders that impose their social systems on peripheral territories to protect empire's econo-political interests. Postcolonial theory. It's an epistemic modality of liberation that combines both anti-colonial struggles with an appropriation of Western humanism to expose the inherent violence of Anglo-European conceptions, pseudo-conceptions of universalism and reason. Now, I want you all to keep these definitions in mind because they're going to help us conceptualize the US as an empire. With this dichotomy of oppression and liberation in mind, we can start to see the way in which empire functions. In part, it functions through exceptionalist discourse, which has allowed it to posit itself as a democratic model and has made its global superpower status axiomatic. Exceptionalist discourse stems from the American Revolution as an epochal moment in world history that has allowed for a self-defining and self-embracing conception of universalism, according to historian Peter Onuf. So, in other words, the US actively engages and posits itself as burdened with this responsibility to police and patrol and guide the underdeveloped regions of the world in its image. In so doing, this discourse nullifies other countries' potential and ability and agency to be equally as exceptional or to be even able to share this denomination of American exceptionalism. Now, can American exceptionalism be shared? Why do I keep saying US empire as opposed to American empire? I'd like you all to please raise your hands again if you use America when referring to the US. All right, that's all right. So, if you picture a map really quickly, just close your eyes and picture a map, right? On the world map, America is actually one large connected landmass, right? So we do have North and South America. Perhaps that's for geopolitical reasons, or perhaps it's a semantic perpetuation of this power hierarchy. But let's just go back to the term America. According to historian Greg Grandin, Latin Americans had once envisioned a hemispheric-wide democratic imagining, but that quickly disappeared due to Washington's increasing militarism and Wall Street's increasing dominance of Latin American economies. We can even extend this to the modern world, right? And we have the Middle East, for example. But This appropriation of America almost seems hypocritical and paradoxical because the US is appropriating America as symbolic of liberal democracy and modernity. Well, it doesn't quite make sense after thinking about this history, right? Now, according to scholar Amy Kaplan, the denial and disavowal of empire is a key part of the ideology of US imperialism and a key component of American exceptionalism. What's ironic to me is that the characteristics of both empire and the characteristics of global superpower are almost one and the same. 1, established economic wealth. 2, capable government. And 3, this desire to play an international role. Indeed, the current discourse of US empire embodies fantasies of a global monolithic order that extends outward from a national center that engages in imperial guardianship, conditional tutelage, temporary intervention, military takeovers in the name of humanitarian work, and actual physical colonies. Now, I do recognize that for some of us, maybe the conception of the US as an empire may still be a little bit iffy. So let's just simply expand our imperial vocabularies and think with a new analytic. Anthropologist Ann Stoler proposes the notion of imperial formations. So, as an imperial formation, the US operates on racialized relations of force with transitional borders that invade and incorporate exploitable areas and displace native populations and resources. So in keeping in mind these theoretical frameworks of self-calculated ambiguity and self-serving superiority, we can see how the US operates as an empire. It's almost a dialectical relationship in that its economic and military infrastructure and its discursive apparatus normalizes its empire. Conversely, it's the denial of empire also normalizes it. So let us now turn to the borderlands, to the US empire in Mexico. Now I just all want you to be aware, as you saw before, that this is just one case study and I'm only going to do some examples, but this is part of a larger conversation. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, which began 2 years prior over a dispute of Texas. The US forcefully acquired a ton of land previously owned by Mexico, and some Mexican nationals did manage to become US citizens, but a lot of them lost their land due to force or fraud. The Bracero Program, which is derived from the Spanish word for arm, brazo, was a bilateral agreement between the US and Mexico that allowed for millions of Mexican men to come to the US to work in agricultural and railroad industries as a response to severe wartime labor shortage. In theory, the program had safeguards to protect Mexican workers. But in practice, a lot of these employers ignored the policies and did still manage to benefit from plentiful cheap labor. And important to note that about 10 years later, many of them were detained and deported through an operation called Operation Wetback, which is a horrific slur. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the North American Free Trade Agreement. It is a neoliberal trilateral agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, in part to keep Mexicans out of the US by creating more jobs in Mexico. In reality, NAFTA has actually made Mexico lose about 1.3 million farm jobs because it simply cannot compete with import prices due to the elimination of tariffs. Additionally, NAFTA has also expanded the program of maquiladoras, or US assembly plants purposely built in border towns to exploit low-cost Mexican labor. And naturally, we all know that the border has been increasingly militarized due to the presence of Border Patrol agents and renewed discussion of the wall. Now, what's interesting to me is that the Borderlands seem to manifest both literally and figuratively, this very fickle, contradictory history that is based on land acquisition, the fluidity of borders, the promotion and expulsion of migrant bodies, of exploitable migrant bodies, and the construction of rigid borders. So it boils down, the US empire boils down to the Mexican, the Latin American, the simply racialized immigrant foreign body to be rendered ineligible for personhood and therefore ineligible for citizenship or rights. Now, I know that this is quite a contentious history, and it seems like I'm presenting as if there's no hope. But I assure you, I do believe that there's some hope. I think that a colonized individual's story can be rewritten through the lens of postcolonial theory so that she, he, they may have a future that is not bound by the violence of imperial debris. So, as postcolonial theorists, I would like to present to you the self-identified Chicana feminist, queer activists and scholars Gloria Anzaldúa and Cheri Moraga, who in their seminal work, This Bridge Called My Back, they politicize themselves and present their vision as women of color alongside with other radical women of color. They write in Spanglish to be able to discover themselves, to achieve self-autonomy by creating a new border culture. But most importantly, they realize that in order to change the world, they must change themselves. Particularly, Gloria Anzaldúa, in La Frontera, the Borderlands, writes the following. She chooses to critique and challenge and change her precarious position and subjectivity in the Borderlands by denouncing both Spanish and US empires and their violent use of knowledge, politics, and religion to impose monocultures that necessarily negated other identities. She chooses her own mode of salvation. Since she is ni de aquí ni de allá, neither from here nor there, because she, along with her people, have been systematically displaced and denied the ability to claim a truthful home in the Borderlands, she chooses to create her own literal and figurative space by creating una cultura mestiza, an ideology of equality based on historical racial mixture. Cultura mestiza consciousness is inspired by Western humanism in as much as it deconstructs duality and allows for identity to arise from multiplicity. So in short, she recognizes herself as fundamentally human. Just let that sit for a bit. I know it sounds kind of simplistic, but if you acknowledge the generational and continuous negation of her humanity, that's quite radical and powerful, right? She no longer sees herself as a spatialized, commodified, sexualized, racialized, criminalized foreign body. She just sees herself. Now, I do recognize that post-colonial theory alone cannot abolish and eradicate uneven global structures and power relations, but it is a start. I'd like to invite you all here to collectively engage in true critical humanism, in true anti-colonial struggles to explore the way that imperial violence has influenced what I call an inheritance of colonial subjection, and how that has influenced today's world and the myriad structures of oppression and marginalization. If collectively we all work to appreciate and recognize the human value and the complexity of the other, perhaps we can get to a point where the other is no longer otherized. Perhaps that way we can affect change. Now, I would just like to thank you all for going on this journey with me, because as a Colombian immigrant, my career at Gallatin has also been my own post-colonial project of liberation, of my ability to claim and my right to my hybrid identity, to claim my space in this globalized world, in the United States of America, at NYU, and at this event, talking to you all here. Muchas gracias.